This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the gem city of Dayton, Ohio. As a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network, we are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs by providing the best customer service and world-class workshops. Visit CornellStudioSupply.com for 20% off the largest ceramic book selection of all time. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters, by potters.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online source for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit www.rosenfieldcollection.com. Hello, my name is Kathy King, and welcome to the For Flux Sake podcast. I'm coming to you from the Harvard Ceramics program in our fair city, Allston, Massachusetts. I'm here with Rose and Matt Katz of the world-famous Ceramic Materials Workshop, and they are ready to answer your burning questions about clay and glaze. Welcome to Fluxed Up, our newest segment here at For Flux Sake, where we talk to makers about what they do and how they suffer. Because one thing is true in ceramics, no matter how good you are or how much experience you have, we have all fluxed something up in the studio. Today's guest is the incomparable Paul Andrew Wandless, Chicago-based artist, educator, and author of Image Transfer on Clay, 500 Prints on Clay, an inspiring collection, and co-author of Alternative Kilns and Firing Techniques, Raku, Sager, Pit, and Barrel with James Watkins, and countless articles that even if people had Xerox machines, they'd be Xeroxing them right now, that have been published in Pottery Making Illustrated, many of which I have used teaching for years. So welcome, Paul.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey, Paul. Now I think we just dated ourselves with the Xerox comment.
I know. Well, I mean, people use copy machines, but I mean, like the word, I didn't say like mimeograph.
Oh, yeah.
The smell. Can you mimeograph onto clay? Wait, now I need to know. Will mimeographs transfer?
Paul, have you ever done that?
Sure. Copier transfers, laser toner transfers. So I could probably walk it back to that too. Well, thanks for having me. All introductions sound like eulogies typically. So.
Sorry. Oh, I should say my voice isn't helping. I'm getting over laryngitis, so I guess I sounded pretty choked up. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to enjoy, I guess, hearing whatever our topics are going to cover. But I mean, my kind of style of testing has always been a mix of things where I rely on a lot of different things. So I'd be curious to see where this goes.
Should we jump into 20 questions? Only it's not actually 20 questions. It's a few questions, but it feels like 20 questions. So what temperature do you use?
Typically low fire. I normally don't go too much above 2000. Like a lot of people now, I don't use cones as much anymore because now that I have a digital kiln, I just put in a temperature and I don't typically put in like a cone number anymore. But as far as cones go, maybe like 02 is the highest I'll typically fire these days, but 2000 is a good number.
Hey, and what kind of clay do you use?
I use brown clays. So I don't really use a particular brand, but I choose my clay body based on what I want it to look like. And I want it to have the same tone as I do. So a lot of my work is sculptural and some of my prints include the clay body. So I'm brown, so I use brown clays.
Lovely. What technique do you use?
All of them.
I know. What technique do you not use?
Well, that's a pretty open-ended question, so I can only really give an open-ended answer to that. But I don't limit myself to techniques, let's say.
Very nice.
if I need to use a technique that I don't know, then I'll learn that.
Yeah. What's your favorite technique?
Boy, I'm sorry, but I really don't have one. It's like you can't pick your favorite. If you have 3 kids, you gotta love them all the same, right? So it's same thing with techniques.
I don't know. I mean, there's not
That.
But we only have 1 kid, so maybe we have kind of. But as cliche as it sounds, really the technique I'm using typically tends to be my favorite. So, but anything that involves using my hands is probably my favorite. And if I drill down a little bit and thought about it, maybe anything that's sort of like a carving related. I do like carving a lot.
Most people don't, in our field, they know Paul as a ceramic artist, but I know Paul as he's a leather worker, he's a stone carver, he's wood carver,
cool.
Printmaker of all types of different printmaking techniques. So
do you do like all of these things like simultaneously, or do you like focus on one thing and go to the next? Or like, are you kind of all at once, or just focus on one thing at a time?
Yes. So in my studio, I do have my clay. I have like different tables, like 3-4 tables. So I do have my clay table where everything's clay related, but I do have another small table that I do leather working, another small area just for my glazes and under glazes and that kind of testing. And then, so I do kind of have like sections so I can work on things independently, but most of my techniques I combine as well. Like when I combine clay and printmaking, then I'm using ceramic materials, but I'm using printmaking methods to, print on clay or use underglazes to print. So it's kind of a hybrid way, but I do work in these materials independently as well and just print on paper. But everything that I do in other mediums, I also incorporate that in my clay work.
Nice.
The diversity, I have to say, is quite inspiring, because especially like with our experience with working with artists and with even on this show, like a lot of the people we've talked to are like, well, I just slipcast or I just throw. And even in more sculpture based process, a lot of people are sort of like, I slab and then I slip and then I glaze and then I'm done. And to have that diversity continue in your practice after all this time and to be able to incorporate it all is pretty impressive. It's almost intimidating to me. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know if I could keep things straight.
Well, I have lots of notebooks.
Oh, dear.
I do. So I do keep notebooks, and I do have a notebook for each medium I work in, so I can keep the technical information in there about that. So if I'm getting back into metalsmithing or something, I can go to that book so I don't have to do experiments over again. So the same way that I would keep my glaze notes, like when I'm experimenting with underglazes, I treat underglazes like regular color mixing. So if I'm mixing 2 underglazes together, I typically stick with a parts method for all of that. So I'll make notes about, this underglaze, this many parts, that many parts. And then when I fire it, what temperature did I go to? And I have a series of characteristics. Like I have a glaze test page that I have different characteristics that I'm looking for. And then each time I do a test, I fill that out. And so I have lots of notes on tests that I've done in the past and the test tiles and the test bars for them. And the ones that I like, I keep. And the ones that don't work, I throw those away. But that was a habit I got into from Victor Spinsky, who was my professor as an undergrad at University of Delaware. So the reason I do a lot of different things is because with Victor, his method of teaching was, if you're a ceramic artist, you need to know how to do everything a ceramic artist does. You just don't hand build. You just don't. So the curriculum was based to be able to do hand building, throwing, be able to make your own clay, make your own glazes, understand what the materials were that you were using. We had to do electric kiln firing, gas, and then all the alternative firing. So that was just part of the curriculum. And then he was a master mold maker. So we learned how to do slip casting and make, complex molds. And I worked for him kind of apprentice-ish, for about 10 years or so. After that. And then he also had patents on, screen printing, doing overglaze decals. So there was a clean room in there where we did color separation to make silk screens So
Cool.
we made clay decals because he was doing trompe l'oeil and he was using decals for his trompe l'oeil work. So when I was introduced to clay, I was introduced to these are all the things that clay artists have to have at their disposal. So that just kind of set the table for me that um, there's nothing that isn't related to clay. So, and he always encouraged us to take other mediums because what you learn in another medium, then you can bring that back to clay. So I was just fortunate enough to study with someone initially who promoted that. So I didn't really see that was the only path I ever knew is learn as much as you can, have as many tools in the tool chest as possible.
Nice.
Oh, that is so unbelievably true. I mean, the one that got me is when I was an undergraduate student, I thought I was going to be a potter. And, I spent all my time in the
Me
wheel.
too.
Yeah. And that we were, we had all the other classes we could take. And, if you're making pots, they encourage you to take the hand building class and glaze chemistry and all that. The one class I was like, I'm not going to take that one was the slipcasting class. And I was like, I don't care. Like I'm 21 years old. I don't want to slipcast. That's so ridiculous. Yeah. Within a year, I was only slipcasting, never touched the wheel again. and it's the one class I had to go and learn it myself. But I have to say it is that thing of all the folks out there that really think that like, you're just a wheel person. That's all you want. Do it all because everything will feed your experience. And it really can't be underemphasized.
And that's true. And you can't remember it all either. You have to practice it.
Yes. You have to practice it. Otherwise it just gets filed somewhere in your brain and then you lose it. So with all those techniques, what kind of things do you struggle with in your studio?
Time management, to tell you the truth.
Oh, really?
Because, sometimes the problem is it's great to have a lot of tools in your tool chest, but then the downside of that is staying focused on a project sometimes, because it's sometimes I'll jump around too much. But the biggest technical problem that I've had probably over the last 10 years is what you guys have talked a lot about on the podcast is just material availability. And also, and for me personally, just storage of materials. The biggest thing is I do a lot of testing. I like to modify my colors. And so to do that, I try to do as much as I can with some commercial glazes and underglazes that I get. But then I'm a big modifier. Then I try to modify them to my specific needs. So sometimes the biggest thing is I can't have a giant, materials kitchen anymore, right? And even though I do teach academically, I don't have access to my to the facilities at school. So that's not something, it's not a resource I can take advantage of or use the glaze room. So everything that I do is just in my studio. So I can only have so many materials in there. And there's only so many materials I even want, right? In terms of trying to be careful of airborne particulates in air, et cetera. So that's probably the biggest challenge is how can I get the most out of a small palette and maybe a small selection of glaze materials that I use to modify. But that got compounded recently with, some things that you use now not being available. So now having to figure that out. So I think that's probably the biggest thing as a glaze modifier.
You already talked about one of the most important things that we've found in our studio, which is not just note taking, but for us, it's full on documentation. And that, when Rose and I started, I was just talking with some of our students about this in a class yesterday. And, when we were students, it was just on the birth of digital cameras. And so we didn't photograph everything. And because, even those
I still
were
have
terrible.
Slides of my portfolio. It's slides.
No, I had slides through grad school.
I don't have a digital version of it. I have slides.
Nope. But for testing glazes and clay and firings, let me tell you, I know it gets more towards the computer and some people don't like computer work, but the fact that you've got a phone with a high quality camera in your pocket is amazing for taking those things and documenting them and then having a visual record. And I know a photo is not the same thing as real life for a lot of people, but let me tell you, the way we work now is we spend a lot of time doing it, but everything gets documented. It comes out of the kiln and it gets photographed and we we put our stuff into files, and then we use PowerPoint, which is boring as hell, but like we put it and it's there so I can always go back and reference it.
Well,
and put the
and
notes.
it's the good and the bad.
Yes,
it's
everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it takes time. And you're talking about sort of the management and keeping track of things, of like, it allows you to do it and then sort of forget it at the same time, because if you need to go back to it, it's there. And like for me, like I can't use physical notebooks because I actually have a condition called dysgraphia, which I have. It's clinically terrible handwriting. It's like handwritten notebooks do me no good.
Yes. So who gets to do all the paperwork? I do.
But I'm really good at putting things digitally. So like I can, type it out and put in the photo next to the text, and then it's all good. But yeah, that management, oh my goodness, because the thing nobody ever talks about with ceramics is a time-based medium. Unlike anything else, you only have a period of time to get that piece done. Like with the stone, you can do it and then come back, and then like nothing changed in that time. But with the clay, you've got to do it. You've got to execute it before that clay dries, or, you got to start again. And so that puts a bizarre amount of pressure. And then there's all the stuff that you produce on top of it. So managing that, you're preaching to the choir. It's a challenge no matter what.
It's a discipline to have a notebook for everything that you do. That's amazing.
Well, it's more of again, it has a lot. It's more of a reflection of folks that I've studied. Like after Victor was big on keeping notes, and then I went to Minnesota State University and studied with James Tanner, and he was also he called them visual journals, whereas more so about writing things in there, putting images in there, and sketches and things like that. Then I went to Arizona State, and Jeannie Otis was one of the professors there. And since I did back then, we didn't call it like glaze calculation and things like that. They were more like materials classes, but Victor was genius with materials, very much a perfectionist with everything. And then James was a bit in the middle, where he was sound in his materials, but he called it kitchen table ceramics, where he was more of a I know what the materials are, but it's more about testing, right? Everybody always preach, test tiles, test tiles, test tiles. So he was a big person to say, I know what it's supposed to do, but make a tile, fire it, look at it. And then if you want to make an adjustment, just adjust one thing, so that way you know exactly what the impact it has on there. So his version of teaching like glaze, like how to test glazes, was, you understand what your base is, remove one variable and replace it with something new, see what that impact is, and take notes on it. And that's how he taught how to learn materials, was just to see what that one variable change would do. And then at Arizona, I TA'd for Jeannie Otis and Richard Burkett. Like hyperglaze was fairly new back then. So he was using hyperglaze. So we had hyperglaze at Arizona State. There's a glaze calculation class where it was kind of a accumulation of what I learned as an with Victor and James. Is very technical, but also kitchen table, where the way she taught it was you would take a glaze, like choose any low fire glaze you wanted, and then take out whatever the colorant was, so you didn't have that in there. And then we would put that into hyperglaze to see the material analysis, just so we knew what it was. And then she did the same thing. She was like, if you chose a matte glaze, then you need to make it satin. If you choose something that, or maybe make it crawler, you had to do something that changed its characteristic, but just use one material. So we would switch something out, and then we'd make test tile, make a 100-gram batch, fire it, and see what it looked like, and then have to take notes about it. And then we would put what the new ingredients were, then put that in hyperglaze to see what the material analysis was. But she didn't want anyone to see what the change was until after the testing was done. So that way, when you saw the numbers change, it helped you understand why did those numbers change based off of the physical tile. So it wasn't just plugging recipes in there and adjusting numbers just theoretically. It was like, here's what's in there. Let's make a test, fire it, take a look at it. What do you think about it? Now let's look at the numbers, and kind of showed how to like troubleshoot using hyperglaze as a tool. And as your note to photos, hyperglaze, you were able to then take images, scan them, and then put them in hyperglaze and put it with the glaze card with it. So I like that, because he had a repository to put all those images with the recipe, and then you could go to the materials data list, and then it had all the information about each individual material, and Like Tanner would say, like, look at your recipe, what materials are in there, and then go to, back then it was just textbooks, there wasn't like internet that we could use. And I had John Conrad's it's a long title, but Advanced Studio Manual, the technical data for
Oh yeah.
I don't know if
Oh
you've ever
yeah.
had that,
Mhm.
but that's
Oh,
always been my
absolutely.
Bible. I still look at it now. He does pretty much cover everything, and there's like 1,000 appendices.
Mhm.
So I'd like to go to that as a starting point sometimes, but it does have all the material data things, even for Fritz, etc. So he would always say, you don't need to learn everything. You just need to learn what you use. So he would tell us to look at your glaze, look at the materials, and look those materials up and see what those specific materials do. And then that way it was easier to retain the information because I wasn't trying to learn what every feldspar did. I just needed to learn the feldspar that I used and what it did in in collaboration with the other materials. So it wasn't about learning a lot fast. It was about learning a little slowly. So over time, you learn a lot. So he was always kind of the tortoise in the race. Victor was a bit of the hare in the race, but so I had both of those approaches. So I'm still like a hybrid of that. I like to keep different. I keep different sketchbooks because for me, that's how I organize things. Like that way, I don't have to sift through a bunch of stuff. And so with my glaze testing, it really is just about I know these materials do what I want them to do, like as far as the dry materials. So when I do add them, I have some general expectations, but they still change quite a bit. But I actually enjoy that too. And we're talking about time in ceramics where you're on the clay clock when you're working with green work. But when I'm glazing a sculpture, it might take me a year to glaze that piece because I will stop and start. Like when it's green, I'll put underglazes on or slips, and then I'll fire it. And then my firings after that, I'm layering colors. I'm treating the surface more like a painter. So I'm taking my time with it. I'm testing glazes in between. With the clay monoprints, you put underglazes on a plaster bat and then you put casting slip on it. But when I'm working on the plaster bat, I could take a year to do that image on that plaster bat with underglazes. So I do look for ways to control my time a little bit, because when I'm teaching, I can only get into the studio on the weekends. Or sometimes during the week, I only have an hour or two here. So I kind of adjust what I'm working on in the studio based on my time available, and then use techniques that kind of I can really leverage and get the most out of them then. But you're right though, with the glaze testing, like if I only have a couple, like an hour to go to the studio and I want to go to the studio, I may just glaze test that whole time, make up a base batch. And then like if I'm testing an underglaze, I do it in a parts method and I just use a like a half teaspoon, for a part. So my base is always 10 parts of the underglaze. And then whatever I put into it is just one part. And then I have a tile that's 6 inches long, 2 inches wide, and I put bars on it. So the very first one is the underglaze by itself. The second one is the underglaze with one part, whatever. And then 2 part, 3 part, 4 part. And then I test that tile, just the kind of a progressive tile. And then maybe only one of those tests work. So that way I know, the 10-3 ratio of the underglaze to that material, that's what works. And then I'll do a second test to verify it where I just do that on purpose and test it again to see if it repeats it. And then if it works, and I like it, then I'll give that a name, and then I put that into my my palette because every clay print I make, I create a new palette for that. So I test before every one because if I use my same underglazes and the same way I modified them with every single piece, then all my work looks exactly the same, just like sculpture, etc. So one thing Tanner always drove into me, he goes, do painters go to take one tube of blue and squeeze it out, and they're only allowed to use what comes out of the tube? He goes, we can't do that in clay. He goes, if we have studio glazes, people just tend to use the studio glaze as is, and they get the color, texture, and characteristic that is closest to what they want. He goes, you have to get exactly what you want. So that's why you need to learn how to modify your glazes and change them to what you want them to be for your piece. So testing's just always been part of my process to kind of always keep that in mind.
Well, I wanted to hone in a little bit more about your work with underglazes because Matt and Rose aren't using them daily. I only use the
No.
beautiful
Just because
color
it's true
black.
doesn't mean it doesn't hurt.
Well, but we have a lot of people, who are listening who are using commercial, both underglazes and glazes. I know you have worked and consulted with a number of different companies. We won't name any specific brands, but I guess have you noticed anything changing with the underglazes due to the, general material changes? And then, knowing that you use these products in different consistencies, you make some thicker, you make some thinner, how that is working for you.
I kind of look at underglaze like acrylic paint in a way, because for the most part, what you see is what you get. So I kind of have like that approach just in terms of the application of it as far as expected colors from it. And you're right, the different companies like Amico, Speedball, Mako, I guess Duncan, they all have slightly different recipes and they're all very proprietary about it in terms of
Mhm.
kind of, and that's what makes underglazes super hard is that like say Amico's brown is not Speedball's brown in terms of the hue, right? So it's a little different than some materials where what it's more of a descriptive thing. Just like when you go to a store, you buy house paint or fingernail polish, they're more like descriptive about what the color is and not what the actual color is. So I really do stick with the color wheel, like the it and color wheel. Like those are my true colors for me. And then when I'm mixing up colors, like when I say medium blue, it's not the medium blue on the label. It's what I consider a medium blue in terms of color theory. So that gives me at least one fixed place of color that I can orbit all the companies around. So I figure out, well, for Amico, their whatever color is medium blue to me. And for this company, that's medium blue. So when I'm doing some color mixing, that's kind of how I have my foundation, I guess. And yeah, there are some colors. It tends to be like browns and browns, reds. Sometimes they're just starting to come just a little bit thicker. Um, the one thing, like, those of us who give like lots of workshops, the one interesting thing is because I have lots of underglazes, in my workshops. So I'm opening up new bottles all the time. So it's interesting to see which ones consistently are thick, which ones consistently are thin, which ones are always a little bit separated. So which ones are brushable out of the container. And there's a little bit of consistency to that in terms of colors. And, it tends to be like anything that seems to be like be brown or purples sometimes tend to come a little thick. Um, so some of it is just kind of, I know it's different from the chemistry side of it, but just not thinking it from a chemistry lens, just really the physical properties of them. And so I do have like the things that I look for with underglazes is just basically brushability out of the container. Because the more water I need to add to it to make it brushable, now I'm starting to dilute it and the color's not as saturated. It's not as strong. So I don't like when I need to put too much water in there. So, and if I do, then that's when I'll get a hold of a company and say, hey, these things are coming kind of thick. And so and sometimes it's just like Rose and Matthew probably know better. I know it's more like a factory side. They have a note on storage and sitting on shelves or certain things that they need to do. But I have noticed like the consistency of thickness has been different with them, which makes me have to add a little bit more water to some, which then impacts my color, the color yield I get from those. So I rather have it a little on the thinner side and then evaporate the water out so it's more concentrated. So that's kind of what I've seen over the years now. It's just like the consistency that we're getting with those. Recently, some of the companies have changed their color palette, which is also reflective of some of the companies changing their clay bodies available, which goes back to they used to have some materials because underglaze is clay, right? It's just fine particled clay for the most part. So if there's things that they can't get for clay, then obviously that's going to impact their underglazes since it's predominantly clay materials in there. So I think that's had an impact as well as maybe their formulation.
The other big thing that's changed with that is that most underglazes are a stain in a slip or an on-gobe is really what they are, and then they're adding in brushing medium and stuff. And stains change. A couple of years ago, Mason abandoned a bunch of colors, And what was interesting is that at the time they were like, well, you can actually just mix these two stains together. And that's all we were selling was two stains that we mixed together for a color.
Yep.
But I think a lot of companies then had to reformulate what they were doing based on those changes. And that is going back to what you're saying about mixing and trying to change value and hue. Is the cool thing about stains is like they're not as chemically complex as a glaze, but the color theory of it does still hold together. You can totally mix together two colors and expect their combined coloration.
I think stains are as complicated as glazes, though. It's just we don't see it because they're manufactured. We just see the end product.
Says the woman who lived in stains. True that.
Yes.
But even with that aside, I guess one of the bigger points I'd want to make is that like with all information that I give, I try to give it in the spirit of what I'm telling you is successful and works under my conditions and my situation in terms of that I have in my studio, which is not going to be the same as who I'm telling has. And so in terms of what you have as even just down to how you store things, right? Because some studios are more humid than others, some are more dry. So they might be using the same materials, but the way that they're stored might impact them, the way that they're used. So I really do try to think of everything as a tool and that I can use to make informed decisions about what I'm doing. So, and again, I know I use a lot of Tannerisms and Victor, but they always would say that things can be as complex or simple as you want them to be.
Yeah.
So Tanner was always big about understand everything completely, but simplify it. Those things make a great foundation for you to stand on, but then you need to walk after that. So the biggest thing that, I like to always tell folks is like, I can tell you things that are technically sound, based in science, based in whatever, but don't take that as your only truth when you're working with your materials, because things are going to be a little different for you. Control your variables, just have as few variables as you can when testing. But, a lot of this stuff really is studio specific. So I think the more people know, but then the more they can kind of just then simplify it to the simple question is, why am I using it? And what do I want to do with it? Then, again, they can be as complex or simple as you might know background wise in terms of the stains. But the truth of the matter is, what the color yield is from that stain. So at least if you can remember that and focus on that, then sometimes that helps people who are trying to just like start in it. So I'm a big baby steps person, understand as much as you can, but just focus on what you actually use and really get a solid handle on that, and then just keep slowly building and building from that.
Keep it simple.
Yeah, keep it simple. We are huge advocates of, I know a lot of people, especially when they're looking at recipes and making their own things, they get really intimidated because, you find a recipe for a slip or for a glaze and it's 8 ingredients. And like, I don't know what all these are. And do I need all this? And boy, I'll tell you, the number one thing that we're doing in our work is purge everything that's unnecessary, know why it's there, and get rid of the crap, because there's a ton of crap in a lot of the things that sort of get passed down. Like people build on things and then pass them down. It's like, well, is that really necessary? And it really does help to solve the material challenges and the things that disappear and the things that don't work when you really pare it down. And that's so inspiring to hear from you, that someone who can be as complex in the studio and in the making process and in the technique, that it still does come down to simplicity to be successful. That's awesome. But that said, I got one more question, because we're not here just to talk success. We want to talk failure. So spill the beans. What's your biggest studio screw up that you can remember?
Probably, and this is not in the past, this is like ongoing.
Confession therapy time. Oh, good.
And this is basically deflocculating clay bodies into casting slip. Because again, I use dark bodies, so the amount of iron in there has an impact on how much deflocculant you need because of the charge, right? So the darker the clay, the trickier it is. And I just love dark clay bodies. Some I don't really use a lot of terracotta, but they're all versions of these darker clay bodies. So, and when you're deflocculating clay to make your casting slip, there's kind of, again, guardrails in terms of what to use and how to use it. But that's always the hardest one. Those are the ones that I need to. And I heard you guys talk about, I think, slips at one point in the past one where typically, because I make all my own casting slip, because whenever I'm hand building, then I want to also cast parts as well. So I need to have the same clay body. So that way I always use the same clay body that way. So if I change a clay body, et cetera, then I need to test it. But I do believe in letting it marinate too. Like whatever adjustment I do, I'll let it sit for a day, maybe 2 days, because it has to fully go throughout and then mix again. It's always a bit of a stronger reaction the morning after. It may not have been as strong immediately because it hasn't, but that's my own fault for just using darker bodies.
Are you're making it from scratch, or you're trying to deflocculate like a commercial body?
I deflocculate commercial bodies because I would love to make my own clay body, but again, I work in my studio, so I just can't. So I do use commercial clay bodies, so I deflocculate those for my casting. So that's always been the trickiest over the years, is since I use it differently. Like when you're doing volumetric casting, like in a void where you pour it in, it has to set up for a couple of minutes, like 20 minutes, and then you pour it out. That's one kind of specific gravity to make that work. Now I do flat casting, so the ratio is a little bit different. I actually want a bit higher clay content there, because if I have more water in there, then the slab shrinks more, and I get a bit more potential warpage. So my number is a little bit higher. Instead of 1.73, it might be as high as 1.8 because it's flat casting. So I change that number based off how I use it. It's always an adventure when I'm playing around with my slip casting bodies to get them to do what I want them to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're almost like tape casting. That's pretty cool.
Tape casting?
Yeah, tape casting. They call that in industry. Where
Okay.
It's a higher density form.
It's how they make a lot of resistors, and so they literally have a ceramic medium that they will cast onto a belt of like an acrylic tape, and so it makes this very thin film that they'll then sandwich together. It's one of the great, when we were in Alfred, it was the artistic medium that every single student would hear about and go, oh my goodness, we need to do that. And then they would find that it's insanely hard to work with and sort of give up.
It is, but if somebody who is really brilliant and using that same idea as Janice Jakelski, and if you look up her work, it's amazing. Paul, this time went by way too fast, but I get to call you this weekend. So
can I say one more thing about casting?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So with Victor, he always preached that the strongest slab you can use is a slip cast slab, because it has equal tension throughout versus rolling it out where it creates a grain. So a lot of the work that he did, he would slip cast his slabs that he would hand build with, because he wanted zero warpage when he was firing. Like if he was doing a trompe l'oeil box that looked like wood, he would cast all those as slabs. And then with a hydraulic press, he would have pieces of wood that he sandblasted, and then he would emboss the grain in there, and then we'd fire them. So that way it looked like it had this hard compressed look. So I did that for a while, where we would make our casting slip. And if I was hand building, I would slip cast my slabs. And then when I was hand building larger, like rectilinear volumetric work, I didn't have many problems with warping or cracking, because it was equal tension throughout the slab, since it was poured versus being rolled out.
Well, I will say that is actually scientifically true, and I've actually studied that in the past.
You win.
I passed the test.
We're sending your T-shirt in the mail.
I have taken the same clay body and made plastic versions and mixed the plastic versions in different ways, and then made the same clay body into a casting slip. And the scientific metric we use is density, literally how dense the particles pack. And there is a distinct difference in density between clays that are plastic mix, which is like mixing in a dough mix, or, sort of as clay as we traditionally know it, making it as a slip and then dewatering it and shaping it plastic. That's the second most dense. But then the most dense is slip casting, because the water extraction of the plaster slab is orienting and drawing the particles to a faster density and they've been mixed better. So you absolutely will get a better slab that way. And making slabs, I mean, I know, everybody loves a slab roller. Boy, be very careful using a slab roller, because the number one thing people do is they'll sort of set it at their height and then they'll just bust out the slabs. No, you set it thick, you do it, you flip it, you decrease the size, flip it, decrease, flip it, and you really have to baby it. But this slip casting absolutely will make it better.
I was going to say all that technical stuff too, but I was holding back on that.
I just,
He knew we had a time limit.
I can just do it fast.
Time constraints and all,
Oh, well, thank you, Paul Andrew Wandless, for being with us.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for
It was
having
so
me.
much fun.
Yeah, I love listening to you guys. So it's kind of weird to be part of it. So, but thanks for asking.
Oh, well,
I
thanks for
appreciate
being
it.
a part of it.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, folks, that's it for this week's episode of For Flux Sake. I'd like to thank the listeners who submitted questions this week. And if you want your question answered on the show, shoot us an email at ForFluxSakePodcast@gmail.com. So join us next time. And when in your studio, remember what Rose always says.
Always remember to test, test, test. This is a test of the emergency glaze system.